I'm very excited to be joined today by Brandon Kramer, the director of the Oscar shortlisted documentary feature Holding Liat, which also won the Berlin Film Festival Documentary Prize. And that's the same prize that was won by No Other Land before it won the Oscar. And we've already been talking. I cannot wait to begin this conversation. And Brandon, I would love to ask you to share your own introduction of your film, but also just say that we know there couldn't possibly be a more touchy subject right now than Israel and Palestine, and most people have little understanding of the complexity, which is something that your film gives us on many levels through many layers, characters of different generations and politics. And Ted and I were talking about the film after, and it really conveys to us the power of film to kind of break through stereotypes and misunderstanding and move people. And so maybe if it's not too heavy a load, Ted thought this was a softball. I'm like, Ted, you're asking me to ask him the hardest question first, but it was his idea. So
It's
we're
okay.
just going
We've
to go
done
there.
we've done
We've
96
said it.
screenings of this film, so you're
Okay,
gonna.
all right. So, really, can you speak both to how you would describe your film and then why you feel film is such a powerful way to tell a story like the one you're telling?
Yeah. So, um, on October 7th, we found out that two of our relatives had been taken, and um, this is a family that Lance and I are very close with. We met them for the first time visiting Israel over 20 years ago. We were at a bat mitzvah with them 2 months before October 7th. So naturally, our inclination was to text them and reach out and say, how can we help? Not at all thinking that we would make a film. As we reached out to them, Liat's father, we thought those messages would just go into the abyss. They're dealing with a crisis. Yehuda, Liat's father, reached back out to us and said he was getting no response from the Israeli government. He knows that my brother and I are documentary filmmakers that live and work in Washington, D.C. And immediately the US government was very involved because Liat's a dual citizen. So very rapidly, Yehuda and then Liat's sister and one of Liat's sons got on a plane to come to Washington, D.C. to try to advocate for their release. And we felt this responsibility to pick up our camera, not knowing if we were going to do it for a day, a week, a year. Our relatives have been thrown into the epicenter of a geopolitical crisis that the whole world was talking about and trying to make sense of. And the consequences of understanding the nuanced experience of what a family like ours was going through was very, very, and still is very, very significant because already, even in those first days and weeks, thousands of people's lives in Gaza and Israelis that were being held were being threatened. And if so many lives were on the line, I think it's really important that we understand how the victims' families actually feel. And as we started to film, and you see this in the movie, one of the first scenes we filmed was Liat's father saying, I do not want my daughter and son-in-law's captivity to be used as justification for violence against Palestinians at all. It needs to be the opposite. If my daughter's life is going to be on the line, then this needs to be a moment to call for peace, for reconciliation, for coexistence. And then the fact that his family didn't agree with how he felt, we were bearing witness to a microcosm of the kind of fractures and debates and disagreements that families all over the world were experiencing. But for Liat's family, it was a life and death situation for Liat and Aviv. So the stakes were incredibly high.
Yes. I mean, you've just spoken to this power of being personally connected to the family you're filming, but at the same time, that might make it all the more sensitive because you can gain a different kind of access that is incredibly close. I mean, Ted and I have never seen a movie like this in terms of the bravery of going into such a traumatic current situation. The stakes are as high as they can get, and you're with this family. So how did you put guardrails in place maybe with yourself or with them? How did you figure out that how did you negotiate this with them? I mean, they're extremely vulnerable situation and moment in time, and there you are.
Yeah, this was the hardest film I've ever made and probably will ever make. I've never made a documentary about family members before, let alone filmed people that are going through this level of a crisis and are this proximate to violence. I think the first thing that we did was really try to show up as family members. So this is not, we weren't there just saying, okay, we're documentarians, therefore we can't be involved as if we don't love you and don't care about you. So I'm helping the family. I live here in DC. I'm calling every senator office I know, every congressperson. I've been through the halls of Congress a lot, working on projects. I'm sitting with them late at night, just providing emotional support. A lot of this film is made off camera as just showing up as somebody who loves them and cares about them. And then, there are the moments that we were filming and, the family was really brave in feeling like Liat is a history teacher. They kept saying Liat is a history teacher and she would want this moment documented. And so the dynamic was constantly us, myself, and Yoni Brook, the cinematographer and producer, being in we're sleeping outside their hotel rooms. So at
Yeah.
2 o'clock in the morning, when they get phone calls from the IDF, we can be there to film what it looks like for a father and a mother to get that phone call that's saying that your daughter's not coming home. We're living in the guest room of their kibbutz with them really 24 hours a day. And the dynamic was I had this intimacy with them. So that gave us access to being in these spaces. But I often felt too sensitive about filming these really painful disagreements and moments of tension within the family. But Yoni, the cinematographer and producer, had this I'm not going to say distance. Well, I guess it was distance, like this emotional distance from the family in a way that he would frequently turn to me and say, no, 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 this is really important that we keep filming. And so I think the sensitivity that I brought to the table as a family member and the more journalistic uh, inclination that Yoni brought to document really difficult moments, not in an exploitative way, but just to really bear witness to what they were going through. That's how we were able to film these really, really tough moments. And then spending a lot of time with each of them, making it clear that there's no antagonist in this film. When you're making a film where the frame of the film is one family, which is the decision we made early on with this movie, we immediately realized we can't tell a story about October 7th or all the hostage families or the Israeli Palestinian conflict. This is a story about my relatives and what they're going through. And once we made that decision, what we realized is the diversity of political perspectives and the diversity of emotional responses to this tragedy in this one family was so vastly different for every person. And so what I wanted to do is make clear to every single one of them that I want this story and this film to empathize with how they're processing this. I want
Mm.
to understand their own political views, whether I agree with it or not. I wanted
Yeah.
to create something that was very authentic, that could allow audiences the space to connect with how different people in this family were experiencing this tragedy, with the hope that by doing that, it could invite a diverse group of people into a movie theater to watch one singular story. We're living in a moment where we're on our phones experiencing completely different narratives around this conflict. And, I have my own views, I have my own politics, but the thing I care about more than anything, you asked this question about film. What can film do? What film can do is by getting really close to the lived experiences of people who are directly impacted and seeing it in all its complexity and contradictions and nuances, it it allows us to get out of these false binaries. It allows us to get out of this very reductive place and actually have to swim through the ways that this experience is affecting different people in different ways. And I think that's
Yes.
really important.
You achieve that. You achieve that so well, and I am so glad you mentioned the phone calls. I mean, we experience you there in this way that's not at all intrusive, but is very, very present and active. I like the feeling of you racing, like running down the hall with your camera to be there to capture the moments of receiving those phone calls. And again, as you've just described, the different responses of the family members are so key. And you sort of have an exceptional family, I have to say, that they're willing to be so open and authentic on camera is unique and rare. And you capture, for example, the marriage between Yehuda and his wife Chaya, who are not just seen as parents of a hostage of Liat, they also are showing us their own personal differences in responding to this extreme crisis. And I don't know if you want to speak to that, but it's something that, again, the marriage, and then you have Liat's son Netta, who is the youngest of three, who travels with Yehuda to Washington and who seems like he really went through a lot of trauma in the situation with his parents when Liat was taken and his father was taken. And then you have Liat's sister, and you have from Portland flying in. So, but maybe start with the marriage because it's very illuminating and relatable what you show there.
Yeah, I mean, right off the bat, Yehuda, like I said earlier, Yehuda's a landscape architect. He's a retired landscape architect. He's never done a TV news interview in his life. He's never been in the public eye ever. He's lived on a kibbutz most of his life. And his daughter and son-in-law are taken captive, and something snapped in him where he just felt, I need to do every single thing possible to A, get them home, and B, if I can't get them home, the values that, he's lived in Israel since the 1970s, and he moved to Israel as part of a socialist youth movement called Hashomer Hatzair, which really was rooted in these values around coexistence, around socialism, around, basically the opposite of the direction that Israel has been moving over the last several decades. And I think he felt that the direction that his country has been moving in is a huge part of the reason why his daughter was taken and his son-in-law was taken, and immediately just became this fierce advocate to say, like, I finally have a platform to actually say my mind. And what was so interesting to me was he immediately was thrown into a universe of people telling him he did not have the right to say that. He was, amidst these other hostage families, and the organizers of the group were saying, you just need to share what plight that your daughter and son-in-law are going through, and that's it. And he said, no, me being silent is actually a political statement in itself about what I think is needed. So I'm going to voice my opinion. His wife, Chaya, their values are very aligned, but for Chaya, her inclination was, I need to stay on the kibbutz, I need to stay in Israel, and I need to be as close as possible to my grandchildren who just barely survived the attack. And her way of processing this grief was to, stay close to them and be with her community and with her family, which is like a beautiful motherly instinct. Their grandson, Ofri, his instinct was the entire kibbutz was evacuated, and he was one of the only people that went back. And he went back because he wanted to pick avocados and work the land in the way that his father did to feel closer to him. So that's the way he processed his grief. Tal didn't want politics to be part of this at all, but felt this responsibility to go to Washington. And so I think,
Tal is the sister, Liat's sister.
Tal is Liat's sister. And so I think, I don't know, I was feeling like when I left the production on this film, I would come into the world in my friends and my family on social media, and the narrative that I was hearing, it was like, you're on this side or you're on this side. The empathy for, if you're having empathy for people that were taken on October 7th, if that's where your empathy lies, then you must be, then the people that are experiencing that must be against Palestinians, or vice versa. And it was being like, everything was being, the victims and the narratives around the victims was being siloed and just put in this really divisive space. And what I was seeing within my own relatives was something that didn't fit any of those narratives. And I think reflected how most families, the diversity of experiences and thought and emotions that most families go through. And I think documentary film and film in general just has this unique power of getting us out of these, these silos and these false choices.
Yes, there's so much nuance, there is so much subtlety, and you give us this full web of, family members and then the larger geopolitics, and there's nuance in all of it. Specifically, what you've raised about when Yehuda is, in Washington and wanting to speak up about, as you said, coexistence and peace, and how he would change the messaging if he were in charge, because he's basically being told the only thing he can talk about is this personal tragedy. It's very important for people to understand and to hear this and to feel what they're going through, which again, they're so open and so vulnerable. What were you hoping to come out of the Washington side of it? Because again, that too feels like unique access. You get in the halls of Congress, you show the parents of hostages speaking with Congress people and beyond. I mean, there's a phone call from President Biden at the end. So I don't know if you even could have anticipated, if in your two previous films that you've directed, you've had experience in, and you're from Washington, with government, but you really give us inside access there too in a very unique way. And again, it's so true. The power of film is constant in your movie because you are helping us get beyond these awful reductive news and social media bites and narratives that are just creating worse polarization. So thank you. But yeah, I don't know how you did the DC or what you expected to come out of the DC side of it.
I mean, to be honest, when we started filming, one of the questions that we were asking ourselves was already the narratives around the victims of October 7th were being used as justification for horrific acts of violence in Gaza and in the West Bank. And it was, as a storyteller, I'm a big believer in cinema verite, observational filmmaking, where you document, when you're documenting truth in front of your camera, the best you can, closest you can get to that. I'm a big believer that that almost always contributes to a greater understanding. But in that moment, we were asking ourselves, we didn't want to tell a story that could in some way be used to justify and perpetuate violence as well. I think when we started to observe Yehuda, um, with this very strong message that was going incredibly against the grain of peace and reconciliation. And you have to remember, it's very commonplace to have that feeling now, but days after October 7th, to be the father of a hostage, of two hostages, and to be coming out with that message was an extremely controversial thing to be saying. And I think we just felt like, okay, what's unfolding in front of our camera is actually, we can actually explore the weaponization of these narratives through Yehuda as this protagonist who's trying to fight against that. And that was a story just completely absent from the media. As far as how to navigate Washington, this is the third film Lance and I have made that looks at very complex stories behind the scenes of DC. Being artists that live in DC, we've, for better or for worse, kind of learned how to document what it looks like, what the sausage looks like behind the scenes. So, like, for example, we know how to film with elected officials because we know you're going to get blocked. We know there's 5 people whose jobs it is to say you can't film this, but there are ways around it. So, for example, when you see Mitch McConnell in the film, they met with Mitch McConnell for an hour. Of course, they said we couldn't film it. We had the camera crew right outside the door. And when they were saying goodbye, we said to Senator McConnell's chief of staff, could we just come in and film just the handshakes at the end? And they were like, okay, that's fine. And we filmed. So in the movie, he's in the film for like a minute. And a lot of these moments where you have these brushstrokes with people in positions of power, institutions, like it's just a minute or two here and there, but that's all you really need because film is not about those meetings. The film is about our family. And so for me, it's actually more about what happens when they leave that office and how they process it together. So when Netta goes on Fox News and they, put his trauma out there in this way that is really painful to witness. It's not about that moment. Yes, that moment's important, but it's about Yehuda backstage in the green room, feeling like his grandson's pain is being exploited in this way and hearing him reflect on that and talk to his daughter about that. And so, we've found a way to bear witness to these little moments that then allow a viewer just to have just enough of a sense that then you can be in these more intimate spaces where the film really rests.
Yes. Yeah. 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 You did a really amazing job of navigating Washington. Um, Yehuda's brother is another character in the film, and we haven't talked about him yet, but he might also be a historian, and he also speaks about coexistence in a way that's quite powerful. And I wonder that decision to bring him in. I mean, obviously, it's impacting him too, what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, once we decided that the frame of the film would be the family, and I say that literally, like in the edit room, and I need to give a huge shout out to our editor, Jeff Gilbert, who maybe we can come to the edit later in the conversation, but he is
Yeah.
just a master storyteller and really one of the best editors at just having restraint. There's such an inclination in storytelling around politically third rail issues like Israel Palestine to really push an agenda, use film to elicit emotion. And Jeff really had this like MO throughout the film of how do I not do that? I don't want to use the score to make people feel something. I don't want to tell people how to feel. I want to give people a lot of space, which seems easier. It's actually harder to do that, in my opinion.
Yeah. The score was really well chosen, by the way. I thought that the tone, you maintain a tone, and the score is very, very sensitive and in sync with that.
Yeah, Jordan Dykstra is an incredible composer. But the question about Joel, the uncle,
Yeah.
we immediately felt that we needed to explore every crevice of this family's experience. And I'm actually related to Yehuda through Joel. So I knew Joel before I knew Yehuda. And I knew Joel because 20 years ago, when I was first going to go to Israel, I had some conversations with Joel about that. And I knew Joel's politics. I knew that he left Israel in the 1970s because he was so disillusioned with the trajectory of where the country was going. And we immediately felt this very strong desire to include him, in particular because the actions he was taking publicly in calling for a ceasefire, in appearing with other bereaved Palestinian family members, was actually like creating some tension and questions amongst his family in Israel. And so immediately we reached out to him. We had to first convince him, like the other family members, that by including him in this film, we were not trying to portray him as an antagonist.
Hmm.
And I want to underline it because it's so hard to film divergent perspectives in
It
one
is.
movie because people, especially in 2025, 2026, they assume that if you're filming with his brother who he disagrees with on politics, then clearly he's going to be the bad guy. And I said to him, no, I want to understand how you feel just like I want the film to understand how your brother feels. And he eventually agreed. And it was such a gift to the film for many reasons. One, because it just opened the aperture of the story in this way that was really critical. And, as I'm telling this story, tens of thousands of people in Gaza are dying. Children are starving. People are being forcibly displaced from their homes in the West Bank and being murdered there as well. And so I clearly, I have this deep empathy for what our relatives are going through and the other hostage families are going through. And you see the pain that they're going through in this film. But naturally, the frame of the film, you have certain limitations in being able to see on the other side of the fence. And Joel, even though Yehuda had these values around coexistence and peace and didn't want their pain to be weaponized in this way, Joel just really brought to the surface this whole other layer. And we were able to film a lecture he was giving about the Nakba and really hear his take on the history of the kibbutzim and the destruction of Palestinian society. And it just really introduced some context that's, I think, critical to any legitimate debate and discussion around this conflict.
Yes, it absolutely is. You've now mentioned the other side of the fence and your ending of your film. Again, how you achieved any of this in the edit. It's such a masterful film, actually, and it's so beautifully interweaving all of these characters and their perspectives and the stories and the emotion that they're experiencing and the crises they're going through. But your choice for the ending is, again, it's excellent, and I wonder how you arrived at that. I haven't even spoken about I think we're at this point where people know Liat makes it and her husband doesn't, but maybe you can speak to that, and then her return to her children and her family, again, so emotional and movingly told, and then your choices with the ending of the film. How did you manage it all?
When we found out Liat was coming home, there's a lot to say about the ethics around just filming with her. So that was a whole universe of just how we navigated that. Once we found out she was coming home, and once we found out she wanted to participate in the film, be in the film, Lance, Yoni, and I had a conversation, and we said, this film needs to end with the meaning that she's created out of this experience. How is she processing this? She spent 54 days in captivity. Her husband was killed. She thought her children were killed. Her community was destroyed. What does this mean to her? What does she feel is needed in this moment to move forward? And honestly, it's a scary thing to do that. Part of the beauty of cinema verite is you're documenting truth. But again, when you're documenting truth or trying to document truth, it's a scary thing because we didn't know, was she held in a tunnel? Was she tortured? Is she going to come back and feel like retribution and violence and angry? Is this what we're going to be documenting? Is this how our movie is going to end? And had that been where she went, we would have figured out how to capture that. But she came out, and one of the first things she did is she wrote an op-ed in the New York Times. And she said, I do not want a single Palestinian to be harmed or killed in retribution for what happened to me and my husband. And I want to work toward a better future for my children and the children of Gaza, is what she said. And she immediately joined a group called the Bereaved Families Forum, which is a group of 800 Palestinian and Israeli family members who have lost loved ones in the conflict, jointly calling for peace. And so she gave me and our team as storytellers the greatest gift I think that I will ever experience, which is somebody who has suffered tremendous loss and channeled that loss into a place of profound empathy. And to bear witness to that was extraordinary. And so the film ends. I was less interested in what she was doing with her life logistically. Like, is she going here? Is she doing this? And I wanted to know internally where she's at. And so we went to film with her. She's a guide at Yad Vashem Holocaust Museum in Israel. And we went to film with her, and she gave a tour, the same tour that she's given hundreds of times before October 7th. And part of the tour is speaking about a poem that is written by a Polish poet about the indifference that Polish and German people felt to the suffering of Jews inside the Warsaw Ghetto. And then we sat with her outside and we did an interview with her, and she reflected about how that poem has taken on a new meaning for her. And she reflected the indifference that she felt and her community felt toward the suffering of Palestinians on the other side of the fence. And to film somebody who processed their own trauma to a place of empathy and also filter that through the lens of history and the lens of a history that is as sensitive and deep as the ghettos and as the Holocaust. It was a statement on humanity that just had to be the ending of the film. There was no choice for me.
I think that's a beautiful place to end this conversation, actually. I really, really hope everyone has a chance to see your film and that it gets the full distribution it deserves. And it really deserves for everyone in the world to see this film. Can you tell us? I know it's coming out in theaters in certain cities soon or now.
Yeah, it just opened at the Film Forum in New York City last weekend.
Okay.
And then this past weekend, it just opened at the Lemley in Los Angeles. And starting next weekend and then through all of February, it'll be coming out in New York City. I'm sorry, in Washington, D.C., in Boston. If you go to holdingliat.com, you'll have the full list of all the cities it's playing at, or follow the film at Holding Liat on Instagram, on Facebook. And yeah, we've now played the film in over 20 countries, 96 screenings. And I'll just say it's been a profound experience of so many people telling us that if you make a film about this, you're going to get canceled. You're going to get protested. People are going to hate you. There's going to, like so much fear in the process of making this film. I'll just end with this and just saying the, the biggest, the guiding light for Lance and I in telling this story has been to confront fear, because the amount of fear that has been communicated to us throughout production, the edit, and distribution, and continually, all of those fears have not been realized. People are sitting in the audience who feel differently, different political backgrounds. I know because they come up to me and they tell me, I loved that character. I didn't like that character. I empathize with this person. I didn't. And so it is possible to create art around this conflict. It is possible for people who feel differently around this conflict to sit in the same space. And it is possible to have conversations across lines of difference, which I think is absolutely needed for us to get out of these cycles of violence.
Yes, I could not agree more. And I am so, so grateful that you pushed through all the fear and that you are showing us how to relate and connect through this deep, deep understanding and empathy through a highly nuanced, moving, powerful story. Your movie, Holding Liat, really is a must see. Thank you, Brandon.
Thank you so much, Vanessa.